All right, we are now recording. Thanks for joining us. I hope that it was easier to get into this webinar than the last one. We have about 100 people on the webinar already, and I believe we had over 200 signed up. So it's really great to see the excitement about pollinators in Addison County and what we can do to plant for pollinators and build habitat for them. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. We have the chat disabled for you all, but we would love you to put any questions that you have in the Q&A that is down at the bottom of your screen. You can just click on the Q&A button and put comments and questions in there, and we will be answering them. Sometimes we'll just type an answer right away if it's something easy, and if it's something to save for the end, we'll answer it at the end. What am I forgetting? Anything else? I think you're all muted and off camera just to save bandwidth for the webinar, but there will be plenty of opportunity for discussion at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over.
So one thing, Brett, do you want to add the link to join the email list?
Yep, I can do that.
It's looking like there is some interest in knowing who else is on the webinar. So what do you think about making it possible to chat so that people can put in their name and town?
As long as they don't put it in the Q&A, they should not put it in the Q&A, because that will mess up our ability to answer the questions.
Yes, so the chat has been opened up. So if you want to go ahead and put your name and what town you're coming in from, that's a way that we can figure out who else is on this webinar and share community.
Got people from New Haven, Moncton, Cornwall, Manchester, Lincoln, Leicester, Ripton, Shrewsbury, Middlebury, Windham, all over the state joining us tonight.
Awesome. So great to see everybody.
Yeah.
Brett, I think you should go ahead.
Yeah. Do you want to do the land?
Sounds good. All right, we start our evenings with a land acknowledgement. This land that we are on belongs to the Western Abenaki, the traditional caretakers of these Vermont lands and waters, which they call Ndakina, or homeland. We remember their connection to this region and the hardships they continue to endure. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to the Abenaki elders and to the indigenous inhabitants of Stolen Turtle Island by finding something outside that is rooting you to place right now. We recognize that environmentalism is a traditionally white space, and we are working to change that. If you have any concerns about equity or accessibility needs, please do not hesitate to contact us. I'm going to put our email in the chat.
Great. Thank you, Brett. So I'm Bethany Barry from Cornwall, and it is wonderful to see so many people on this call. It's grown a lot since we started with an idea last fall, which was pretty simple. My husband and I went to a talk at Horsford's nursery on pollinators in September. One of the presenters was a young woman who said, if you want to do something that's good for the planet and see quick results, plant a pollinator garden. It stayed in my mind. It gave me hope through these divisive and challenging times. How could we do this? So I posted on Front Porch Forum, would you like to make a difference with climate change? Do you love gardens, flowers, and color? If so, let's plant pollinator gardens in Cornwall and create a haven for these little guys who are so essential. I got 9 responses in an hour, with more coming. So I thought, okay, now what? This clearly resonated for people. So maybe we can start here at our house. We have a variety of landscapes, including woods, meadows, gardens planted for birds and wildlife, fruit trees, and I had now marked space for a pollinator garden to get rid of some lawn. I invited people over. This was before Omicron, and we were outside, and there were 14 of us, including Fran from Weybridge and Brett, a student from the college. There were a few I knew, but most I didn't yet, because we're all neighbors after all. It was a lovely sunny fall day, and we walked around looking at the gardens, the edible hedge, fruit trees, stone walls, meadows, and fields, and ended up sitting on the patio. We talked, and then Brett said he'd like to share, which was wonderful, because he told us about the pollinator pathway, which began in Connecticut, where he was from. Synchronicity at its finest. He told us that we need pollinators: bees, butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, birds, and bats. 75% of our food depends on pollinators, and they are endangered because of us. Pesticide use, loss of habitat, and climate change. We learned that lawns are pollinator deserts, and rewilding and planting native plants, trees, and shrubs all will help. Pollinators need swaths of native flower growth and no neonicotinoids, chemicals which are designed to kill bugs. So how can we help them? We need to think regionally and build connectivity for pollinators and each other. Stop the isolation of the pandemic. So Fran and I got busy thinking of everyone we knew in different towns and emailed them to come to a Zoom steering meeting. We held our first webinar in November, led by Brett and Andrea Landsberg, a master gardener and member of the Cornwall Conservation Commission. We registered with the Pollinator Pathway Northeast under Vermont, one of 9 states who have pollinator pathways, sent out more emails, and now we have town reps from 12 towns: Cornwall, Weybridge, Middlebury, East Middlebury, Moncton, Leicester, Shoreham, Whiting, Lincoln, Bristol, New Haven, and Virgins. We've been meeting on Zoom, reading Doug Tallamy's books, realizing that we need to educate ourselves much more about this before we get our fingers in the ground. So if you're interested in being a part of this, you can let us know by email. And our speaker series is the first part of our community education. And Donna Merrill, founder of the Pollinator Pathways, was our keynote speaker last week. Many of you heard her, and we have a recording of that talk if you were unable to. She was inspiring and informative, telling us how it has grown in 5 years with many different kinds of projects throughout New England and still growing. Emily May is our second speaker, who will speak on planting for pollinators in Vermont. She works for the Xerces Society and lives in Cornwall. We are so lucky to have her. So Brett will introduce her.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brett Gilman. I'm a sophomore Feb here at Middlebury College. I serve as special advisor to the Pollinator Pathway of Addison County. I'm very excited to be introducing our guest speaker tonight. Emily May is a Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Pesticide Program at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. She first got interested in pollinators as an undergraduate at Middlebury College, where she studied biology and environmental studies. She actually planted a pollinator garden on campus that is still outside Bicentennial Hall, where I'm joining you all from tonight, over a decade later. She received a master's degree in entomology from Michigan State University, where she studied pollinator habitat restoration, ground nesting bee ecology, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. Her work at the Xerces Society since 2015 has focused on supporting crop pollinators through habitat creation and protecting bees and other beneficial insects from pesticides. As I mentioned, Emily is an alum of Middlebury College, and she's now a member of our very own Pollinator Pathway of Addison County Steering Committee, and she's joining us tonight for a talk on pollinators and native plants. We're so glad to have her here tonight, and I know she's got an amazing experience in store for the about 290 of us who registered tonight. With that, I'll turn it over to Emily. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Brett. Thanks everybody for joining us. My name's Emily May. I work for the Xerces Society, and I will be speaking to you tonight about planting for pollinators in Vermont. So we're going to cover some basics of pollinator ecology, particularly the ecology of our native bees, and then how we can support those pollinators with native plants and build habitat in lots of different spaces, big and small, in our mix of working lands and towns and yards and gardens here in Addison County. So again, if you have questions as they come up, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat, put them in the Q&A, and we will answer them at the end. So this is probably going to be about an hour-long presentation. I have a lot to cover. So I will start with just a little intro on how I got into pollinators, because I'm really excited to be able to work on pollinator efforts here in Addison County. I, as Brett said, first got into bees as a college student at Middlebury, thanks in part to my advisor, Helen Young, in the biology department, and her expertise and interest in plant pollinator interactions. And thanks also to this guy who kept trying to organize a subgroup to save the bees in the student environmental group on campus. We ended up doing a research project together on Vermont pollinators and securing funding to do this pollinator garden, native perennial pollinator garden on campus, which is still in front of By Hall. And that guy from the environmental group is now my husband, and we live in Cornwall. And it's all sort of coming back together. We live a mile and a half from By Hall. I'm still trying to save the bees. So I, after Middlebury, went to Michigan State and studied wild bees on blueberry farms and in wildflower restorations across West Michigan. You know, we still have a lot to learn about where and why bees choose to nest in different places in the soil. And so that was a question I was really interested in. So that photo up top is a picture of me putting out what's called an emergence trap, which basically captures bees emerging from the soil, which is a very labor-intensive way of trying to figure out where bees nest and answer questions about, well, what makes this a particularly good place for a bee to nest? So I'll talk more about bee nesting later on in the presentation. If you aren't familiar with my organization, the Xerces Society, we are a science-based nonprofit organization that's dedicated to protecting wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates, spineless animals, and their habitats. So the Xerces name comes from the Xerces blue butterfly, which is the first butterfly in the US known to go extinct due to human activities. It lived in dune habitats around San Francisco. And we have staff all over the country working on this. We have programs in pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered and aquatic species, pesticide protection, and urban work. And we use a variety of different tools, restoration, research, education, outreach to further our mission. So let's get started. I think if you've tuned into this program, you're already aware of how important pollinators are for natural systems and for us. Pollinators allow wildflowering plants to reproduce, to produce those seeds and fruit, and continue to reseed in their environments. The seeds and fruits that those plants produce are also food sources for lots of other kinds of wildlife, from birds to mammals to us. And through that simple act of moving pollen from flower to flower, pollinators are building out the base of the food chain for many species. They're also part of that base themselves. About 9 in 10 bird species will eat insects at some point in their life. And caterpillars, or larval butterflies, are an incredibly important source of protein for many birds, especially when feeding their young. So pound for pound, insects actually contain twice as much protein as beef. And so they're this incredible protein source for other wildlife. So why do we need to talk about conservation of these species? We don't always have the monitoring data to say, well, this species is in decline or that species is in decline, but there's a good amount of evidence overall suggesting that we're seeing declines in abundance of our pollinating species due to the same stress factors that threaten lots of other kinds of wildlife. Bethany already mentioned all of these: habitat loss, pesticide use, diseases and competition from non-native species, and then climate change. And we could spend a whole talk talking about any one of these threats, but we'll just think of them as these big buckets that we're trying to deal with. We know enough to act, to take action, and we're going to need all hands on deck, from big to small, to be able to conserve pollinators. What can we do to help conserve these really incredible animals? We can protect existing habitat. We can create new habitat. That's what we're going to talk about today. Some of us might not be managing land, but we can all work on educating ourselves, educating others, and then participating in policy making and planning at all levels, from town planning committees to state and federal legislative efforts. There's something in here that each of us can do. So back to basics. I'm going to try and keep this brief and get to the goodies on gardening for pollinators, but knowing the pollinators, knowing their biology is an important step for trying to understand how we make our landscapes more hospitable for them. So who's out there doing this pollination thing? There are lots of different animals that visit flowers, usually for that kind of sugary hit of nectar, and end up pollinating those plants. Many insects and birds pollinate, including butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, wasps, hummingbirds, even mosquitoes in some cases. Mosquitoes are known to pollinate orchid species in the far northern places of the world. And plants benefit from having a diversity of potential pollinators available. But out of all of these animals that visit flowers, bees are the VIPs. They're the very important pollinators. While many of the animals on the previous slide visit flowers for that nectar, bees are actively collecting and transporting pollen around, bringing it back to their nests for their young. They are a lot better at moving pollen than those other animals, and they have special hairs and adaptations for collecting it on different parts of their bodies. One other feature that makes bees especially good pollinators is also behavioral. So they tend to exhibit what's called flower constancy. So it's almost like they go on a date with one kind of flower and they decide they like it and they know how to get the most pollen out of it. And so they visit that same kind of flower over and over again because it's more efficient for them to do that than to learn how to get pollen out of some other new kind of flower. So this behavior is actually great from a plant's perspective because it means that the bee is mostly bringing them pollen from that same species of plant instead of clogging them up with other kinds of pollen that don't help that plant reproduce. So for all of these reasons, I tend to focus pretty heavily on bees. One critical thing that I haven't mentioned yet is just how many kinds of bees there are out there trucking around pollen. There are more than 300 species of bees here in Vermont and nearly 3,600 different kinds of bees across the US. They come in lots of different colors and sizes and have many different characteristics. So let's take a closer look at our beautiful furry friends. Bees evolved from wasps. Wasps are carnivorous. They feed their larvae, their offspring, soft-bodied insects. So bees are kind of like vegetarian wasps, having evolved to feed their babies on pollen and nectar instead of on other insects. One of the things that distinguishes bees from wasps and allows them to more efficiently collect that pollen for their young is their hair. Wasps have simple hairs, one strand, kind of like our hair. If you look at a bee's hair under a microscope, bees have kind of spiky branched hairs that allow them to that helps them collect pollen with static electricity. So sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to distinguish a wasp from a bee. Wasps that are bee mimics are sometimes pretty good at mimicking bees and vice versa. But you could tell the difference under a microscope for many reasons, including that they have different kinds of hair. So yeah, there's lots of beautiful adaptations for bees to collect pollen. Different bees collect and carry pollen on different parts of their bodies, which can be related to the type of flower that they have evolved to pollinate. Some bees are going to carry pollen dry on their legs or all over their bodies. The two bees on the bottom left and the bottom right here are leafcutter and mason bees. These are in the same family. And these bees have hairs, pollen collecting hairs on the bottom of their abdomen. So that means they can basically belly flop onto a flower and move around. And their pollen collecting hairs there just soak up those pollen grains from the flower. So they're really efficient pollinators of these open flowers like apple flowers. The diversity of pollinators, their shapes, their sizes, where they have pollen collecting hairs, how long their tongues are, all of these features are echoed and reflected back in the diversity of plant shapes and structures, where they offer their nectar and pollen rewards, how those are accessed and transferred when a pollinator lands on or crawls into or hovers in front of a flower. Every single one of these flowers has a different pollinator story to tell if you take the time to look and to listen. So some of you at this point might be wondering, well, how the heck do honeybees fit into this picture? So honeybees are a single species. The European honeybee was brought to America by ship with European colonists. It's a single species that's pretty unique. It's managed by humans. It's not at risk of extinction because it's managed by humans, and its nest is provided for it. It comes in these social, really large colonies of thousands of workers with a single queen. These colonies are perennial, so they could last for multiple years, depending on the health of the queen, health of the colony. By contrast, native bees, there's many, many kinds. They are just annual species. So they are not living perennially over multiple years. They're not managed by people for the most part. There are many of these bees that are at risk of extinction. These are the ones that are living all around us in the ground, in stems of plants, in wood, and are mostly solitary, kind of inconspicuous bees with small nests. Many of these are really dependent on native flowers and have a long history of co-evolved relationships with the native plants. So in terms of where they are nesting, this is something that I was really interested in. You know, we usually see bees when they're out visiting flowers. That's how we see them. But bees are visiting flowers because they're gathering that pollen and nectar to take back to their nest for their young. So in order to be able to conserve these insects, we have to know a little bit about where they live and what they need. Most of our native bees in the US are quite different from honeybees. The vast majority are living below ground with only tiny holes to give any sign that they're there. The other third approximately lives above ground in tunnels that are in old snags and in pithy plant stems. That's a mason bee that you see there that has built its nest in a hollow reed. And a small number, the cavity nesters, the bumblebee species, form small colonies like a honeybee in hollow cavities, which could be above or below ground, commonly something like an old rodent hole. That would be what they're using. So it's not just flowers that bees and other insect pollinators need. They also need the right conditions for their type of nesting behavior. So ground nesting bees, just to give you an idea of what you might look for, they can look like ant nests or just like round holes in the ground. But underneath that, they have these incredible branching structures of their nest where they're digging down and laying eggs on top of pollen and nectar balls that they've put together. And sometimes that can be a few centimeters below ground. Sometimes it might even be a meter below ground. These bees are really incredible. Some of these ground nesting bees are lining their nests with like waterproofing secretions. They're almost wallpapering them to try and protect their developing young from soil moisture conditions. Sometimes the holes to these nests will be under sturdy forbs and grasses or in exposed bare ground. So if you do find nest sites, if you see bees going in and out of the ground, protect those nest sites where they're found. And Donna mentioned this on our webinar last week, but I would recommend trying to avoid full coverage of areas with plastic and landscape fabric or heavy mulch. Try and leave some of that just bare soil available where it's possible around the base of plants or somewhere in your garden so that bees have some access to soil that they can dig into. And this is what a stem and tunnel nesting bee, so the above ground nesting bees, will develop a nest into a reed like this. This is a mason bee nest. And I just wanted to feature this because these bees have some really incredible capacities. So the mason bee will basically go into this hollow reed, put up a mud partition to stop up the end of the nest, go out and make dozens of trips to flowering plants, collect pollen and nectar, build this pollen mass upon which she lays an egg, and then make another nest partition with a wall with mud, and continue the process. So this can be many dozens of trips, hundreds of flower visits to provide nectar and pollen for just one egg. So this is why, in part, it's really great to have lots of flowering resources around so that she's not having to travel too far from her nest in order to be able to get that pollen and nectar. But one of the things that's really cool about bees is that they are haplodiploid. So what that means is a female, a mated female, can choose to either lay a male or a female egg. So if she fertilizes the egg, it's a female. And if she doesn't fertilize the egg, it is a male. So in the case of these tunnel nesting bees, often when you pull them apart, what you find is that the female, the mother will lay female eggs towards the back of the nest, the ones that are more protected from predators like birds, wasps, other things that might come in and take resources away, and will lay the male eggs towards the front. So in the springtime, when these bees come out, the males will excavate out first and emerge first, and then the females will come out later. And this is just to help ensure that her genetic line is going to continue on as best as possible. But it's kind of an incredible thing that these bees are able to do. I don't know how many of you have thought about the life cycle of bees, but if this is old news, I'm sorry. It's helpful for me to think about what's going on with these bees over the course of a year to help think about how we can conserve them. So this is a mining bee, an Andrena bee, comes out in the spring. She digs down into the soil, finds a nest site that she likes, and then, like the mason bee I described earlier, she's going out, making floral trips, bringing back pollen and nectar, and building up this pollen and nectar ball that her offspring is going to develop on. She lays the egg on top of the ball. This is underground. That egg develops into a larvae and then pupates. And then the next year will emerge from the ground to spend a few weeks as an adult doing the same thing. So this is an annual bee. It lives for a few weeks and builds as many nest cells as it can, lays as many eggs as it can during that period. And then she dies, and then her offspring will come out the next spring. So that's how the life cycle of a solitary bee works. It's one female doing all of the work to provision the eggs that she's laying underground. Bumblebees are a little bit different. They are our social native bees, like honeybees are social, where they are founded by a single queen, but then that queen produces workers that emerge and help her with the colony. So those workers emerge in the same year, just a couple weeks after she lays them, and help her care for and care for her new developing offspring. So unlike honeybees, these last only one season. I'll talk more about the life cycle in a slide or two. And they're much smaller than honeybee colonies. This nest might only contain a couple of hundred workers at most. Like I said before, oftentimes these are cavity nesters that are nesting in abandoned rodent burrows, brush piles, under tussocky bunch grasses, or in cavities of trees. And we have about 17 species here in Vermont, but that's a little bit generous. There's a couple that haven't been seen very much, if at all, in the last few years. Unlike most species groups, bumblebees are more diverse in northern and mountainous regions. And a lot of times species become more diverse as you move towards the equator, but bumblebees are an exception where they're more diverse in northern areas. So in the US, the Northwest US is the biodiversity hotspot for bumblebees, but Vermont really isn't too far behind. We have a lot of bumblebees up here. So the way that the bumblebee's life cycle works, they form these annual colonies formed in the spring by a solitary queen. So the queen comes out, she's this big, beautiful queen. She starts her colony just like a solitary bee. She's going out making trips to willows, making trips to maples and other early spring forage, and she's laying eggs and building her nest in her cavity. That first generation of worker bees will come out mid-spring, and then they will take over all of those kind of dangerous foraging trips while the queen just focuses on laying eggs underground. So they build up the colony over the summer, but she lays, consecutive generations of brood, new workers come out. And then by the end of the summer, they've really built up, and she starts to transition over to producing the reproductives for sending out in the next year. So she'll make male bees and she'll make new queens, which get special resources and are larger than the worker bees that she's been producing up till then. Those new queens and males leave the nest, they mate, and then the mated queens find a suitable site to overwinter. That's called a hibernaculum. So that's down on the right-hand side here. They're little short burrows in soil. And then they spend the winter, dormant underground, and will emerge early in the spring to start the process over again. So this is the bumblebee life cycle. So that early springtime is a really critical period for bumblebee queens. They are, again, kind of hard to spot. Bumblebee nesting is a real challenge, just like all ground bee nesting. But some of the things that some of the areas we've found bumblebee nests look kind of like this: straw mulch. They love compost piles, raised beds with lots of organic matter that stay a little bit warmer through the winter. They'll nest in a lot of different places, kind of inconspicuously, but sometimes you'll get close and you'll hear the little buzz or rumble of the colony. And then the last bees I wanted to talk about, because they don't get a lot of attention, are cuckoo bees. These are kleptoparasitic bees. Up to 20% of all bee species are cuckoo bees. So like cuckoo birds, these are nest parasites of bees. So they are laying their eggs in another bee's nest. The larvae will kill the host larvae and eat their pollen supplies. So these bees are not collecting pollen. They're taking the pollen resources from another species. But actually, these are really indicative of a healthy bee community when they're present. So they are kind of wasp-like because they don't have any of those pollen adaptations that most bees have. Their bodies are not hairy. They almost have an armored, heavy-duty kind of look, because what they're doing is just taking over the nests of other bees. But where these bees are present, they indicate that there's a good, healthy bee community that is even available for them to parasitize. So I actually think these bees are really, really cool, understudied bees. Wanted to mention them. All right, so let's get into the meat of this presentation, talk about what pollinators need to thrive and how we can build spaces for them. Where we find opportunities for protecting and improving and building new habitat for pollinators could differ a bit, depending on whether we're in a backyard, on a balcony, in the back 40. But in the end, what all pollinators need are food, shelter, and protection from pesticides. Those are sort of the three keystones to providing space for pollinators. So for bees, that's thinking about flowering plants that provide pollen and nectar, and then undisturbed spaces to nest in the ground or in plant stems. The great news is that insects are able to exploit small patches and partial habitats that are suitable for nesting or foraging. So a patch would be something like a significant natural area, a space large enough for a particular species to be able to successfully carry out some part of its life cycle. How big a patch is needed is going to depend on the species. A small solitary bee is going to need a much smaller patch of habitat than something like a black bear, right? So when you look at the landscape from above, you might be able to identify stepping stones, smaller areas that act as refuges for plants and animals that are moving between larger patches. Corridors or pathways, like stepping stones, are those things that connect larger patches of habitat to one another, allowing movement from one refuge to the next. So pollinators, we can work on connecting larger patches that support big, diverse populations of pollinators and other wildlife by building these stepping stones of habitat. Connectivity is really important for allowing bees and plants from one small area to interact with and reproduce with bees and plants from other areas. This gene flow is what allows populations to maintain this healthy diversity and persist over time. Oops. Note that pollinators as flying insects don't have the same barriers to movement as other wildlife. Migratory vertebrates have even greater needs for connectivity. some of which are being considered in town conservation plans like Middlebury's. This is a screenshot from the Middlebury Conservation Atlas that's been a project of the Planning Commission and worked on by Middlebury geography students. In Middlebury, as is true for the rest of the county and many other places, river habitat corridors are this really important feature that connect larger tracts of conserved forest and open lands. But we have many other ways to connect existing green spaces in our patchwork of public and private lands. Every single small patch of habitat is going to contribute to the ability of a flying insect to go out, tank up on nectar, find pollen for its young, and fly back to its nest. So what we are wanting to do is build more pollinator-friendly towns, neighborhoods, and communities that are better able to support these animals. So that's lots of spaces where they can land safely, tank up, from gardens to shrubs to sidewalk strips, curb strips, bee lawns, what have you. Lots of opportunities here. But you might be wondering, I came to this to know what to plant. So let's talk about that. Many of the pollinator seed packets that you'll go out and find advertised that are pretty inexpensive, they're usually mostly annuals, things like cosmos and physia and poppies, usually include some non-natives, poppies, Siberian wallflower, bachelor's buttons, that kind of thing, which do provide nectar, but they're not restoring those missing links between native pollinators and the plants that they've co-evolved with over so many generations. So they are a step in the right direction. They're going to provide that kind of nectar tank up, but I kind of want to talk about long-term goals. What are the features of the best possible habitat that we can build for pollinators? And that looks more like high-value native perennial plants that provide a succession of bloom periods. So having something blooming, ideally multiple things blooming at any given week through the growing season. Thinking about host plants in particular, plants that have those special relationships, with butterfly species, with bee species, and then some nesting plants, bees that provide those pithy plant stems for stem nesting bees. We want plants that are appropriate to your site, so they're not going to have issues with, diseases and pests, things that are going to do well with your moisture conditions, your soil conditions. And then, of course, that those plants are going to be free from pesticides since you're planting them to conserve pollinators. So one thing to keep in mind going to a nursery is that it's generally best to avoid double-flowered hybrids or other kind of ornate, showy, modern varieties and cultivars, which can, in some cases, produce little or no pollen and nectar. These showy petals, the double petals, are actually replacing anthers, the things that produce pollen, with petals. So they have little or no pollen, and the nectar can often be somewhat inaccessible. So all plants are not equal. Just because it blooms doesn't mean it actually provides resources for bees. So we want to focus on some of the native perennial plants, straight species, if we can, that actually are providing those resources. And of course, we want to make sure that plants we're planting for pollinators aren't contaminated with insecticides. Many things in the retail nursery industry are pre-treated with insecticides at some point in their production, either in the production nursery or in the retail nursery. So I don't know what sources you're buying your plants from, but it's good to have that conversation about the practices that are being used at the nursery, and to make buying plants that aren't pre-treated a priority. Pesticides are considered to be one of the primary drivers of insect declines. It's one of the reasons why insects are struggling across lots of landscapes. And during that nursery production, bees can be exposed to those pesticides directly, or plants that have been treated with systemic insecticides, which are water soluble and can be transported up into the pollen and nectar of plants, where bees can then forage on them. So we don't want to be exposing bees and butterflies in your pollinator habitat, even if you don't use pesticides yourself, but you're just purchasing these plants. So have that conversation. You can get more detail on pollinator-friendly nursery production in a couple of our fact sheets, which are available on our website. Buying bee-safe plants is meant for consumers, and then we have a guide for nurseries on offering bee-safe plants. So thanks a lot for helping to keep our bees healthy by committing to finding and purchasing bee-safe plants. So let's come back to what to plant and why we need to be thinking about those stories, those relationships between plants and their pollinators. Excuse me. Some plants need certain bees. So an example here is closed bottle gentian, which is entirely dependent upon bumblebees for pollination. Only bumblebees are large enough and strong enough to be able to pry open the closed petals of this plant and wriggle inside to reach the pollen and nectar. So if bumblebees in this ecosystem decline significantly, so would this gentian population. These plants need certain bees, as opposed to these kind of open access plants like this goldenrod that has many, many different kinds of animals that could potentially pollinate it. On the other hand, some bees need certain plants. Including species from a range of appropriate plant families can tend to benefit a wider variety of wildlife. But there's these specialist bees. Some bees collect pollen from a wide range of species, and other bees will only collect pollen from a single species, or more commonly from a few related species in the same family. So here in Vermont, we have about 33 species of pollen specialists. That's about 1 in 5 of our bee species here. And one of the interesting things about specialists is that it's actually rare for specialist bees to be dependent on a rare plant. It's usually the other way around. Bee species will specialize on more common plant species. So the aster family plays host to the most specialist bees. There are specialists that visit goldenrods, sunflowers, asters, black-eyed Susans, coreopsis, thistles, other aster genera. Willows host over a dozen specialist species in the eastern US. The heath family, Ericaceae, which is blueberries and cranberries and huckleberries, also host close to a dozen specialist bee species. And then I wanted to mention this neat specialist, Macropus, the fringed loosestrife oil bee. There are only a few species of this genus in the US, and these bees actually feed on the pollen and floral oils of native loosestrife. So this loosestrife it's not providing them with nectar, it's providing them with oils. So the females of this species have really big hind legs with specialized hairs for collecting oils, and the oils are used in place of nectar for mixing with the pollen to feed their young. They also use the oils for lining their cells, the cells of their nests, to help waterproof and protect the nests from excess moisture. Loosestrife is a wetland plant. These ground nesting bees are often found nesting in stream banks near this water-loving host plant. So they need those oils to waterproof their nests. So if you want to learn more about pollen specialist bees, there is a great website on specialist bees of the Eastern United States put together by Jared Fowler and Sam Droege, which you can follow that link down below. Butterflies, of course, often also have deep relationships with the plants that they've co-evolved with and can be quite particular about which plants they will lay their eggs on. These are known as their host plants. Some species will only use one kind of plant. The famous one, of course, is monarchs and milkweeds. Xerces maintains lists of host plants to help people select the appropriate hosts to support eggs and larval caterpillars. We have this great book, Gardening for Butterflies, that includes a lot of information about host plants if you're interested in that. So I'm going to go through some of my favorite plants throughout the season here in Addison County. So I talked about how we wanted to have resources available for pollinators throughout the growing season. We have some bees that come out in early spring for a few weeks. We have some bees that come out for a few weeks in midsummer or a few weeks in fall. And then we have bees like bumblebees that are present the entire season. And early spring is a particularly critical period to be thinking about for bumblebees and for other early spring bees. It's this vulnerable period for bumblebees because the queens are out on their own, seeking a nest site, building up pollen stores for the colony. So the availability of pollen at this time is an important driver of colony growth and development throughout the rest of the season. A good start helps bees win the race, as it were. Early spring is also vulnerable because of the variability in weather conditions at that time of year. I mean, we've even seen it this week, right? It's gotten warm and then everything's melted and then it's going to snow again. That's going to continue through our many fall springs here in Vermont. So shifts in climate can lead to more variability like that, which is a challenge for bumblebees that can emerge days before plants start flowering as snow melts early and soils warm up more quickly than air temperatures. So what's the answer here? We can't solve climate change on our own, but we can help build resilience into our local environments and plant a diversity of species that bloom in early spring to help build resilience for bees that are emerging early on. If one thing doesn't do well, hopefully another species will do well and be there for those bees. So woody plants are usually the first thing that blooms in the spring. These are a wonderful resource for early flying spring bees, and many of these pollinator attractive species are producing seeds or fruit that provide resources for birds and other wildlife later into the year. Native trees and shrubs are a great investment in your local wildlife. They also provide vegetative structure that you don't get with just a meadow. So woody species, you can build structure that helps kind of break up a hard woodland edge, for example. If you start to build in some of that vegetative structure going into a meadow, you can get more escape cover for other wildlife along with this great early spring forage. So some of my favorites are willows. Willows host so many specialist bee species and generalists. That is an incredible pollen source. Serviceberries, native dogwoods. So not all dogwoods are native. Double check before you buy. A great native dogwood is gray dogwood. Also red osier dogwood, which has wonderful red twigs and loves wet feet. Fits the bill in a lot of different wet soils here in Addison County. There are many important trees as well, maples, especially red maples, cherries, and then blueberries, which is another shrub. Oaks aren't an important pollen source for bees as far as we know. It has been found in metabarcoding of bee collected pollen, which is basically like DNA testing for pollen. But oaks host hundreds of caterpillar species that are food sources for birds. So they're also an important one to consider when you're thinking about trees and shrubs in your landscape. The other thing I like to look out for in spring is these spring ephemerals, which are these incredibly important early spring resources in rich deciduous woodlands. And we have great examples of this all around the county and close by us. Spring ephemerals like this Dutchman's breeches that the bumblebee is foraging on are preferred resources for queen bumblebees. So one of the best places to look for queen bumblebees in early spring is in these wooded areas with rich soils, with ephemerals, bloodroot, Dutchman's breeches, etc. Before the canopy closes up and there's still a good amount of light that reaches the forest floor, you'll find bumblebees in there seeking nest sites and foraging. So if you have a woods that you can augment with some of these spring ephemerals, that would be a good fit. Spring beauty, toothworts, trout lilies, trillium, they're gorgeous, and they have many bee species that visit them in early spring. So these photos are actually all from Niket Bay State Park in Colchester, which is a great place to take a walk and see spring ephemerals in bloom and spot lots of happy mining bees, bumblebees. And I've seen quite a few kleptoparasitic bees there too that are a great indicator of a healthy bee community. So moving into mid-spring, this is goldenalexanders, physia, aurea. This is another of my favorites that is attractive to a variety of bees and beneficials. And I've tried to pick plants here going forward that are good in a range of soils. So most of these plants can do fairly well in both wet and drier soils. So this is a plant that has a pollen specialist bee, a mining bee, Andrena ziziae, that visits it. It's also a host plant for swallowtail butterflies. One thing to note about it, it looks really similar to wild parsnip or poison parsnip. So I would recommend Googling the difference in the leaf patterns between those two before you go out and say, oh, I have this already. You might have poison parsnip, and that's a challenging one. Another favorite for spring is wild columbine. This is another mid-spring plant, great for shade gardens. It does well in shaded areas, rocky areas. And it, as you see in the picture, attracts hummingbirds, bumblebees, kind of long-tongued bees. It's also the host plant for the columbine dusky wing, which is a skipper butterfly. Beard tongues are another spring favorite. Beard tongue derives its common name for the hairs that line the protruding lower petal of these tubular plants. And these hairs serve kind of an interesting function because they force bees deeper into the flower. Some penstemon species also have small protrusions in the flower interior that act like hooks, giving the bee a little bit of a squeeze, making it harder to get out. So as they're trying to escape, the anthers of the flower that have that pollen wrap around the body of the bee, getting pollen just where it needs to be to meet the stigma of the next flower and transfer pollen and reproduce. If you look into the flowers, you'll notice several lines leading to the back. Those are known as nectar guides, and they kind of act like runway lights, advertising to bees that the good stuff is back here. So there's a few different species of penstemon. There's foxglove beard tongue. There's also hairy penstemon. These are late spring to early summer flowers, attractive to bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, another specialist bee, Osmia distincta, which is a mason bee, and they are a host plant to checker spot butterflies. So lots of great things about penstemons. So now we're moving into early to midsummer. So these are milkweeds. I'm sure you're all familiar with milkweeds. Lots of different kinds of milkweed native to Vermont. Swamp milkweed, common milkweed, poke milkweed, four-leaf, world. Those might be a little bit less familiar to you, but we do have them here in Vermont. These are attractive to so many insects besides monarchs. Of course, they're this incredible, important host for the monarch butterfly, but they also host the milkweed tussock moth, which is another native species, and they're just the center of activity for lots of different insects in midsummer. Bee balm is another center of activity. Wild bergamot is the one on the right here, and this is actually the rusty patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis, which is an endangered species, historically found in Vermont, but hasn't been seen since, I think, 1999 up here. But this is a great attractive plant to a variety of bees, wasps, and butterflies. The species on the right here is dotted mint, Monarda punctata, and that's more of a drier species, dry soil species, but it attracts lots of different kinds of insects and bees. These plants are widespread across North America. The Oneida called this species number 6 in honor of it being the 6th medicine given by the creator. I should mention that many important pollinator plants have been cultivated and stewarded by indigenous peoples for food and medicinal uses across large parts of their range, including bee balm, including echinacea, coneflowers, boneset, goldenrods, lobelia, blueberries, many, many more. So many of these plants have been cultivated for a long time. Another favorite for summer is mountain mints. So narrow-leaved mountain mint pictured here. This is a midsummer plant that's largely a nectar plant. You'll see tons and tons of insects coming and finding their nectar hit here, attractive to lots of different kinds of bees, wasps, and butterflies. And I would say don't sleep on the summer shrubs as well. One of my favorites is buttonbush, which is a midsummer plant that likes wet soils. So I planted a buttonbush last year, literally just in a pond almost in my back meadow. And it seems to just absolutely thrive in it. It's just standing water and it's doing great. So one thing to note about this species is that it's only hardy to zone 5. So if you're up in the mountains, this one might not work as well for you. This is more for the valley soils, but it attracts bees, butterflies, and birds throughout the season. So season-long interest. Now we're moving into late summer, early fall. You're probably all familiar with Joe Pye weed, but what a great pollinator plant. So there's a couple different species of Joe Pye, spotted Joe Pye, purple Joe Pye. It blooms midsummer to early fall, likes wetter conditions, and it produces seeds that actually last into winter and will feed goldfinches and wrens and juncos. Lots of different things use this plant. This is another critical period moving into mid to late fall, again for bumblebees. So the overwintering success of those newly emerging from their colonies mated queens is going to depend on the energy stores that they build up during fall. So having this diverse fall forage will help those mated queens build up their reserves and make it through the winter in their hibernaculums to come out the next year. So some of my favorite plants, these are going to be plants that you probably see around, but just because they're common doesn't mean that they aren't worth planting in your own space. So lots of different asters that support lots of different specialist and generalist bees, smooth aster, New England aster, frost aster. These attract lots of different insects, and they're just wonderful, wonderful plants that do well in a range of soils. There's also asters that do well in wooded areas, shaded areas. So look around a bit and you should be able to find a species that works in your conditions. Same with goldenrods, lots of options for goldenrods. If you have open land, you probably already have goldenrods, so let them grow. These are truly wonderful. I want them to be cover species for pollinator plants because every time I take a photo of a goldenrod, there's more than one thing on it. There's also, again, sun and shade species for this. So there are plants that would do well in a wooded area as well. So what we're trying to do here is really create that all season interest to pollinators. Have things blooming in summer, have things blooming in fall. It also creates interest to us aesthetically. It's lovely to have things in bloom at every time in the season. It's also great moving into the winter to have these plants that have these seed heads that are great for birds and provide forage and cover throughout the winter. So just some quick design tips. One thing to think about when you're trying to design your landscape to get these species in is maybe try and select your woody species first and then design other habitat features around them. So this is an example of a woodland that has some spring ephemerals underneath your existing trees, your large and small woody perennials and canopy trees. And I didn't have a slide for them, but I wanted to say don't skimp on native grasses. Native grasses are host plants for butterflies. They provide bumblebee nesting habitat and overwintering habitat. This is prairie dropseed, but there's lots of bunch grasses, little blue stem, Canadian wild rye. There's lots of options for bunch grasses. So you can fit them in all kinds of different site conditions as well. So this is an example where you have your woody perennials, you have your perennial wildflowers, and you have your native bunch grasses. And underneath here, this is just highlighted to sort of show that's kind of the habitat that bumblebees will use. So they'll kind of crawl under that thatch to form their nest. This is an example of a rain garden that was created outside of a library in Minnesota. The area was kind of degraded before, and then they put in these beautiful perennial wildflowers. Just in this one picture, there's 4 plant families. So this bioswale it ran directly into a storm sewer. So having this was a win-win for many different reasons, but also a lovely pollinator garden now. So where can we put habitat? There's many, many ways to incorporate what we've talked about tonight on a working farm or in rural areas. So I'll also talk about a few examples of that. Don't feel limited by this. Old fields, wetlands, field borders and marginal areas, hedgerows and fence lines, windbreaks, cover crops, intercrops, wooded edges and understories of forested areas, solar installations. There's Be the Change is housed right here in Addison County. So there's ways to put pollinator habitat under these solar fields that are going in around the state. Lots of options for getting these pollinator plants into rural areas. And farmers and ranchers and other land managers can receive financial and technical support for conservation. So there are these programs, conservation programs funded through the Farm Bill and administered through US Department of Agriculture that offer cost share and payment options for conservation on working lands, farms, grazing lands, haylands, forest. This is really important for, pollinator habitat can be expensive. So these are a way to make it a little bit more accessible. They also offer just basic technical support, like what should I plant? How should I do this? Where do I plant it? And they can develop, farm specific conservation plans. So to get in touch about these, you can visit our local NRCS office right here in Middlebury, and that they can get you on your way. There are many ways also to incorporate what we've talked about in towns and more urban and suburban areas. So insect habitat can exist in yards and home gardens, town parks and trails, landscaping around buildings and facilities, schools, colleges, rain gardens and bioswales like the library I just showed you, sidewalk strips, and containers. I mean, habitat can start in just a container on a balcony, just a stopover for a bee on its way to another patch of habitat. So I don't want us to feel limited by, not having access to large areas of land. We can all be contributing to pollinator conservation. There's lots and lots of turf grass. Across the US, there's 40 million acres of irrigated turf grass, something like that. It's one of the largest non-crop crops. And so I think we should be thinking about converting lawns to something more useful. That's right, currently over 40 million acres of lawn in the US. So native perennial herbaceous plants, native perennial trees and shrubs, edible fruits, vegetables, herbs, flowering lawns. Doug Tallamy has started this homegrown national park idea. This is a movement to convert half of those acres to native diverse wildlife habitat. So you can sign up to say that you're part of this homegrown national park that's converting lawn to native plants and vegetation at homegrownnationalpark.com. So how do we do this? I have lawn that I'm thinking about converting. So it doesn't all have to happen at once. You can just kind of chip away at it year by year. If you're wanting to do a bigger project, some of the ways that people will convert lawns is a couple different ways. Sheet mulching with cardboard and other materials where you really just try and sort of smother out the turf grass and then replace it with other plants or with seeds. Or you can do what I'm thinking I'm going to do with mine, which is rent a sod cutter. And it just slices the turf right underneath, right at the roots. And then you just roll that off. And then you have open soil to be planting into. So that's probably what I'm going to be doing with my own area of lawn that I still have left to convert. But again, it doesn't have to be the whole thing at once. You can just kind of chip away at it, maybe move like a foot out every year as you have time and materials available. And then, one of the questions down the road is, do you establish something with seed or do you transplant? Seed is, of course, a lot cheaper, but it's hard to come up with a seed mix that is definitely going to germinate and establish well in your conditions. So it requires really thorough site preparation. It requires sort of understandings about how long it takes to develop. The first year after you've seeded, a planting might sleep. The second year after you're seeded, it will leap. Sleep, creep, leap. Third year is about when you would start to see mature plantings come around. So this is more appropriate for larger areas. Transplants are going to get you there a lot quicker, but of course they're a lot more expensive. So, and irrigation is often needed in the first couple of years. But if you're thinking about larger areas, I'm also happy to chat about, what might be appropriate for your space. And I'm going to have my email at the end of this presentation. So one last thing to think about in terms of management of your garden is thinking about leaving the leaves. So overwintering, leaves serve as this great overwintering habitat for lots of different insects, beetles, butterflies, moths, and more. So what we recommend, where instead of having a really manicured area, leave some layer of leaves. If you don't want to leave them right on your only area of grass, you can rake them up and spread them on your vegetable or your flower beds for mulching, pile them around, your ornamental trees and shrubs, etc. Try to avoid shredding leaves if you can, like flail mowing leaves, because that tends to destroy some of the beneficial insects that might be nesting in there and overwintering in there. So if you can, just kind of like rake them up and leave them around like this garden here. They will also, help provide that kind of organic matter and nutrients for those areas where you leave them. So last thing I'll talk about in terms of garden management is that third leg of the protection of how you can make pollinators thrive, right? So one of the three key things that pollinators need is protection from pesticides. Pesticides are used in all landscapes, urban, suburban, ag, natural areas. There's pesticides being used everywhere, sometimes, and especially in urban areas for cosmetic reasons. So in terms of protection from protecting pollinators from pesticides, it's not just about making sure the product that you're choosing to use doesn't have a warning sign about bees. An important step is just prevention, not considering pesticides to be the first line of defense. If you have some kind of unwanted plant or insect, using them as a last resort rather than as a first step. So we should be trying to avoid pesticide use in response to aesthetic concerns. This photo on the left is from a bee kill that occurred from treatment of aphids in a street tree in Wilsonville, Oregon. It killed thousands of bumblebees in this parking lot where these trees were treated with a systemic insecticide that got into the pollen and nectar of this tree, and lots of bumblebees came by and were affected by it. So we want to be avoiding situations like this. We want to be using pesticides only as really a last resort, rather than when they threaten the health of a plant or loss of a crop. And there's lots of non-chemical options for managing pests before considering a pesticide. So I could give a whole separate talk, and I'm happy to, about managing pests while protecting pollinators, but I will just try and leave you with some of the information about how pesticides get to bees so that you can think about it yourself for now. So how do bees actually encounter and pick up a pesticide? They might get sprayed directly. That's kind of the most obvious way. They might visit a flower that was previously sprayed. And then plants can actually pick up pesticides through the soil, and pollen and nectar get contaminated from these systemic insecticides. So things like grub treatments are actually systemic insecticides. So some of the things that we're putting on our lawns to control grubs might get into neighboring flowering plants. Same with some of the treatments that are used for like termites or carpenter ants. So something to be thinking about if you're thinking about doing treatments around the foundation of your home is to make sure you don't have really pollinator attractive plants that are going to be pulling up things like fipronil into the pollen and nectar and contaminating bees. Bees can also get exposed to pesticides in their nest materials. So you have leaf cutter bees that are taking leaf materials from contaminated plants, or you have bees nesting in the ground that are contaminated by pesticide sprays. So this is just to get you thinking about all of those routes of exposure for a bee with a pesticide. They can get exposed even if bees aren't around at the time of application. So just things to be thinking about in your management. Now, if you are living really close to cropped land that is receiving pesticides, this is also something for you to be considering as you're thinking about introducing this great pollinator habitat. So we want to be putting pollinator plantings in areas that have the least risk of pesticide drift. So if you're butting up right against an orchard or some other crop that you know is receiving pesticides, you want to be thinking about, well, maybe I should put my pollinator habitat a little bit away where it's not going to be contaminated from air blast sprayers, for example. And if you don't have any space to do that, think about putting up some kind of drift barrier, like an evergreen coniferous windbreak that can help catch some of that drift before it reaches pollinator plants. All of this is helped out by having good communication with your neighbors and knowing what's happening next door if you can. So I can provide more resources on this in particular if you're interested. So I'm just going to wrap up the last bit of this talk by talking about how to community build and engage in your community, as everyone can be involved in this kind of an effort. One thing that I really recommend is use signs to showcase your habitat. So a lot of times pollinator habitat starts off looking pretty messy and a little bit chaotic. It's really helpful to just have a sign that says, this is what I'm doing. And it also helps people want to get involved as well. Sorry about that. You can also get involved in community science efforts. So I'm going to talk about Bumblebee Watch on the next slide. And then also build community support for these efforts. Join the pollinator pathway, work with your neighbors and get them involved, get your schools and towns involved. I won't talk about this much, but there's an effort where you can become a Bee City USA, where your town actually can commit to certain pest management practices and putting in habitat, and you can proclaim yourself as a Bee City USA. And then if you're interested, we can work on municipal and state policy. There's lots of ways to incorporate pollinator habitat and pest management into policy making. So if you have a smartphone and you want to be involved in monitoring bumblebees, this is a great community science effort, Bumblebee Watch, where you can basically go out, take a photo of a bumblebee on a flower, put it into the app or onto the website, and it will help you identify what that bee is. And that ends up going also into research efforts that are monitoring these species over large ranges. So if you love taking pictures of insects on plants, I would recommend signing up for Bumblebee Watch and putting your observations in there. So one other thing I wanted to just mention, we've been working on ways to increase access to these plants. So because there are lots of barriers to access to pollinator plants. They're expensive. It takes time to go get them and bring them and put them into your yard. There's transportation barriers, availability and awareness barriers. So one of the efforts that we've been working on at Xerces is habitat kits, which are basically a contract that we make with nurseries to produce pollinator plants. And then we make these kits available through an application process and give them out to different projects like schools and river restoration projects, et cetera. This is something that a pollinator pathway participant, we could think about doing something like this where plant kits are given away that are scaled to different planting areas, small to large, if there are funds available to do this. This is a great way to get lots of people involved in pollinator conservation and lower the barrier to finding the right plants. So something to consider for a similar pollinator pathway effort. If you want more information, we have lots of info on our website for bringing back the pollinators. We're at xerces.org. We have our Pollinator Conservation Resource Center and lots of info on pesticides. We have many books that were written about attracting bees, attracting butterflies. So many resources on our website. Again, xerces.org. Go to our library, click Get Involved to explore community science projects and other opportunities. And we are a member-supported organization. So if you're interested in our work, you can support our work by becoming a Xerces member. But all of these things are downloadable for free on our website. So I will end there and open it up for questions.
Wow,
Great.
Emily, that was an amazing talk. Thanks so much for sharing all of that information. I learned so much, and I can't wait to hear from some folks in the audience about some questions. We're going to start with the first question we got here, which is, once bees collect the pollen and move to another plant, how do they release the pollen?
So that's a great question. And it does sort of depend on where they are collecting it on their bodies and how they're behaviorally sort of moving it around. So honeybees and bumblebees actually sort of wet their pollen and put it into pollen baskets on the sides of their legs where it's less accessible to move between plants. Whereas something like a mining bee or a sweat bee or a mason bee, they all kind of collect that pollen sort of on the underside of their legs. And so it just kind of moves off naturally as they move from plant to plant. So it just kind of gets brushed off dry. And they have this, like I said, they have these branched hairs that create this kind of static electricity. So as they move onto a plant, the pollen just kind of gets sucked on from static electricity onto their branched hairs. I hope that answers your question. It kind of just comes off.
Awesome. Moving right along here, we've got, is it good to build those tubular bee houses as pictured on one slide?
So that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I would say that in general, in our landscape, that is not a nest resource that is super limited. So that's more of a benefit in areas where there's so much impervious surface everywhere, like urban spaces, and there's not as much natural dead standing logs and snags and pithy stemmed plants. I would prefer us to be just sort of planting those plants that bees would be nesting in naturally, rather than concentrating them in those tunnel nests, which can, if they're not managed and sort of cleaned out and sanitized, they can become a place where pathogens can build up over time. So I think, you know, on a small scale, it's really not a big deal either way. If it's a thing you like to watch, amazing. If it's, but I would prefer us to be putting out, you know, the plants that bees could then find their way into nesting sort of on a small scale, rather than concentrating a lot of bees in an area that can build up some of those pathogens, if that makes sense. I can also share, I'm happy to share resources about how you can manage those better to be cleaning them out from year to year.
What do you suggest to do to protect yourself and the bees when they are in the ground or mulch piles where we are active outside? Getting stung and swarmed is uncomfortable. What do I do about that?
That's a really good question. So, you know, there are some also social wasps that nest underground. So sometimes what's happening is, you know, we're coming across a social wasp's nest and they're swarming you and stinging you. Typically, the solitary bees nesting below ground aren't going to swarm you. It's just a single individual bee. Bumblebees will get startled and defensive if you, for example, turn over a compost pile and they happen to be living in it and are unhappy about their nest being disturbed. So, you know, the best thing I can say is if you know where a bee nest exists and you're able to move around it and not disturb it, that's the best way to protect yourself. Sometimes there's hard decisions to be made when, you know, I'm allergic actually, as I developed an allergy over the course of my grad research studying bumblebees. I developed an allergy to bumblebees. So sometimes there are hard decisions to be made if there's something that's really interfering with your quality of life going in and out of your house, for example.
Wonderful. That's a really important question that I think a lot of people have on their minds. So thank you so much for answering that. Next, we've got how do we determine our diverse habitat patches in Addison County that we need to connect? That's
a great question. I think we should join the pollinator pathway and we should talk about that. I think we're gonna talk about our spring forum, but that's a question that I definitely have. I want to be identifying, you know, key pieces of land that we should be thinking about conserving, and how far away do we need to be putting more habitat that accounts for kind of the flight distances of bees that are coming out of those big patches of existing habitat.
We've got next question is about some of the showy species that you talked about. Can you provide some examples of what might be showy double petal plants to avoid for a pollinator garden?
So actually things like cultivated roses, generally speaking, don't have accessible resources for pollinators. There are roses that have an open flowered shape, like the Carolina rose or the pasture rose, where you have like obvious structures with pollen on them that a bee would be able to access. But those cultivated roses that are, you know, wonderfully smelling and beautiful plants bees aren't able to get in there because they've replaced everything with petals. So there's just nothing accessible to a bee.
Next, we've got a question about whether it's dangerous to pollinators if nearby crops are have pesticides. Stan Walker says he lives next to large fields with a farmer who uses genetically modified corn, sprays his field to remove understory in competition with his corn, and adds fertilizers. He's wondering if this is dangerous for pollinators on his land when the corn flowers.
Okay, good question. So I think in general, no. So I think you might be thinking about BT corn in particular. So there's a few things to unpack here. First, most corn and most soybean at this point in the United States are planted with seed treatments. So those seeds have been coated with neonicotinoids, often accompanied by a fungicide. And they're just kind of being applied to all corn seed that's being sold by major seed companies to deal with the corn rootworm, which is an early pest of corn. But they're not being used in any kind of discriminate way based on where there was existing pest pressure. So that, I think, poses risk to a lot of wildlife across these millions of acres where this treated seed is being used. It's posing a risk to aquatic invertebrates where that is, leaving the coating of the seed and getting washed out into local waterways. So that's the first part of that question. So we really need to be increasing farmers' access to untreated seed. Right now, it's really difficult for them to access seed that hasn't been coated with a neonicotinoid. But the second part of the question is about sort of the genetic modifications. And a lot of times what that question is responding to is BT corn, which is a genetic modification that allows the corn to produce this basically like a stomach protein that is hard and spiky and pokes holes in the insect gut when it comes into contact with it. So BT is something that is not toxic to humans. It's producing this protein that's toxic to a specific group of insects. So in this case, caterpillars. And so it has some potential downsides to monarchs and other caterpillars in ag landscapes, provided that they are exposed to and ingest the pollen of the corn. Field research seems to suggest that there isn't much ingestion of BT pollen by monarchs foraging in these ag environments. So I would say that the risk of that is relatively low to non-target species. But the seed treatments are really a big issue across a lot of ag land. And I think something that I hope that we'll be following up with more policy options, because farmers really need access to untreated seeds.
Next, we've got a question. How well did the hybrids compare to the straight species for nectar or pollen value? About nativars.
So we don't have a huge amount of research on this. Annie White, who did her PhD up at UVM, was studying some of the value of nativars relative to straight species. And I think that it depends on the species. In general, I recommend that you seek out straight species because they have better pollen and nectar resources. But some nativars also have pretty good resources as well. It's just that they've been selected for their attractiveness to humans rather than their attractiveness to pollinators.
Wonderful. Next, we've got a question about someone who has some non-native plants in their landscape that are really good for bumblebees. They have a lot of bumblebees on them, and they're wondering, should they pull it up if it's not native?
No, I don't think you need to pull it up. I think there's cases where you have invasive species that are outcompeting native vegetation, and I would recommend replacing those if you can with native vegetation. But if you're finding that the plants in your landscape are attractive to bumblebees, I don't see any reason that you would need to pull those out, as long as they're not, threatening your other vegetation and outcompeting everything else. I think non-native species have their place, especially when they're already in your yard.
Wonderful. Okay, looking for some more questions here. Are there resources to support propagation / seed harvest of native pollinators to support conservation programs?
Could you repeat that? Was that propagation of pollinators?
So the question says, are there resources to support the propagation or / seed harvest of native pollen maybe it's for native pollinators, like through conservation programs?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but I think we are going to be having talks later on in this series about seeds, like propagating seeds and how you can kind of harvest and propagate out plants for pollinators, if that's part of the interest. the conservation programs that I mentioned are primarily for putting in habitat for pollinators. So let's say you have, an old field that was previously cropland or previously pasture or something, and you want to be putting in a meadow or a hedgerow or something like that. Those conservation programs through the USDA can help pay for that installation process.
Awesome. We've got another question about seed. Is it important that the native plants are grown from local seeds, or is it fine to just have native plants?
So part of this is an infrastructural question. If we had local seed available, that would be the thing that I would prefer to see happening. So if you have the capacity and the time to go out and wild collect seed from local ecotype species, that's wonderful. And I highly recommend that we look into that. As it stands, we don't have a supplier that I know of that is supplying local ecotype seed right here in Addison County. So that's something that I'm hoping that we'll be able to build through this community effort over the next few years. And for the meantime, native plants from the same kind of precipitation climate area would be the best next thing to do. So where those plants are available already from a supplier, that's the next best thing for sure.
And I'm just going to add on to that question there that we have a talk coming up in a few weeks with the Ecotype Project that will specifically answer that question. And we'll talk more about what Emily just shared with us. Next question here, this might be our last question, is please, could you clarify what native plants tolerate shade?
Oh gosh, there are a lot of native plants that tolerate shade. So all of those spring ephemerals that I mentioned, the wild columbine. Again, I have my email is up here. So if you have questions like this, I can supply more plants. I feel like I would have to mention dozens of species to be able to best answer this question for different times of the year. But woodland sunflowers, zigzag asters, there's lots of things that could potentially grow in shade.
Well, wonderful. Thanks so much for answering those questions. I know there were so many on this list. We didn't have a chance to answer all of them. Emily's email is up here. So if you feel particularly inclined about a question, feel free to send her an email. And we will keep moving with some other announcements tonight.
Okay, thanks, Brett. I'm going to announce the speaker series coming up. We've had 2 webinars now, and the next one is Thursday, March 24th at 7 p.m. Mary Ellen LeMay, she'll join us for a talk called The Green Corridor, Improving Biodiversity in Backyards and Protected Lands. And she's going to talk about creating sanctuaries for biodiversity for large-scale land parcels, and why our lawns have to become stepping stones for building habitat for pollinators as they move across the landscape, as well as rewilding and land stewardship. And then on Thursday, April 14th, this is going back to the question about seeds, seed celebrity and ethnobotanist Sephra Alexander, the seed huntress, will talk on this topic: ecotypes, ecoregions, and ecological restoration, fortifying the living seed bank for the pollinators. And she will share the Ecotype Project, a revolutionary initiative that has created a model for native plant material development. And it's just what we were talking about. And I've actually personally ordered some plants from this group, and it is part of our ecoregion, which is ecoregion 59. I planted those plants and they're outside in the cold, and hopefully I'll have some to share. And then lastly, we'll have the Pollinator Pathway of Addison County Spring Forum, because we heard from so many of you that you wanted a platform for connecting with other people interested in biodiversity and rewilding, just like you in your town. So the Pollinator Pathway is all about talking with your neighbor, networking with friends, meeting new people, and sharing in the buzz. So at this event, you'll be able to do just that. We will put you in breakout groups based on your town to connect with your neighbors. So please join us for this community building around our favorite topic, rolling back the lawn and rewilding the landscape. So this will be Tuesday, April 19th at 7 p.m. So hopefully Brett is putting these in the chat right now if you want to sign up for these. We'll be sending out information on several upcoming speakers, and don't forget to fill out your form if you want to be part of this going forward. So this is important to know. We have a point person for PPAC, Pollinator Pathway of Addison County, in many towns already, and we could use a few more. Some of the towns aren't, we don't have anyone, but we'll be putting you in touch with those people shortly so that we can start building this out town by town and neighborhood by neighborhood. So now I'd like to close by thanking Emily for donating her time tonight. It was an amazing presentation. I've been to a few of these now, and this was just stunning. Thank you, Emily. And
so
also
much.
to Xerces Society for access to their technology systems. I also want to thank Bethany and Brett for helping to organize. And thank you to the Rewild Mid Initiative at Middlebury College's Sunday Night Environmental Group for being part of this tonight. So thank you everyone for coming. And there were 100 and, how many people were on here? 183 people signed on tonight. So this is obviously something that people are excited about. We're excited to see how the pollinator pathway has grown, and we look forward to staying in contact with you. This is about creating community, fighting climate change, and helping create habitats for pollinators. So thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks, everyone.